Welcome back to this episode of Homeboat Workshop. Today is another Q&A, and we're going to talk about specialized tools for building guitars. So I was asked the question, what specialized tools do I have to have if I'm going to try to build a guitar myself? That is a really great question because there are tons and tons of tools out there made specifically for building guitars and musical instruments. Now, just because the tools are out there does not mean at all that you have to have every single one, because they can get really expensive. Especially some of the manufacturers, the prices are really kind of high for a lot of their specialized tools. Some of them are great to have, and I have a few of those, but some of them would be nice to have, but you don't necessarily need them. So let's jump in and look at some of the tools that I recommend. This is not an all-inclusive list. It's just some of the tools that I have and some of the things that I feel that are necessary. First off, if you're going to be building a guitar, you need to be able to measure and mark things accurately. So, squares and good rulers. I like to use the ones that are made of nice heavy steel and have some good laser etched markings. To me, they just seem a little bit more durable, and also I really like this little machinist square. Now you can get these things in a bunch of different sizes. I think this is about 7 inches or so from end to end, and it works really good. It's not too big, not too little. Once in a while you need a little bit smaller square to get into a smaller space, and I just have this little steel 2 by 3 inch square. It's really rigid and it works really well. So good marking and measuring instruments. I usually just use regular pencils, sometimes a mechanical pencil if I really need to be super accurate, if I'm marking out fret positions or something along those lines. Speaking of marking out fret locations, I use this steel fret location ruler from Stuart McDonald to mark out fret locations. Now you can get these things in several different scale lengths depending on what you're building. Also, I believe they have like banjo and mandolin and stuff like that. So if you would rather just mark it out instead of measuring each individual fret, these definitely are very handy. And if you didn't want to use one of these, there are many fret calculators available online that will do all the calculations for you, and you just have to make precise measurements from the nut to each fret position. It'll give you all the dimensions and you can just lay it out that way. And in order to get that measured out really accurate, I would definitely recommend using a pair of calipers. That way you can get really exact measurements and your frets are going to be where they're supposed to be. Once you have the position of all your frets measured and marked out, you need to be able to cut the slots for the frets. And there's several different ways as well to do that. I've been using this fret saw, also from Stuart McDonald. It has a little adjustable stop on here that helps you set it to the correct depth. And as soon as this little piece of clear Lexan comes in contact with your fretboard, this saw basically will stop cutting because it won't let it go any deeper. Really handy for getting accurate depth. Another way to do that is with a flush cutting saw. Now this one here, this is a fairly inexpensive fret saw that's made by Veritas. Sounds expensive, but it really wasn't that expensive. That I think I picked up at my local Woodcraft. It has the exact same kerf size as this fret saw. I've done a few necks using only this saw to cut the fret slots. Now you have to be careful that you don't cut too deep on one side or the other, and keep it very level and even, and it's a little bit tricky to measure the depth, but you can do it, and this works fine. Just make sure the saw you're going to use has the right kerf to match the frets that you're going to be installing. If the slot ends up being too wide, your frets are not going to fit very snug, and if it's too tight, it's going to take a lot of force to drive those frets into the slot, and it could cause you some complications down the road. So check the specs on the fret material that you're using and try to get a saw that matches whatever that dimension is. After you've got all the fret slots cut nice and even, you need to install the frets. First method, using a hammer. Now I would recommend like one of these hard plastic mallets, or even better like a brass head. Also works really well. Something that is definitely softer than the fret material you're using. You don't want to mar and mark up the frets. Either one would be an excellent choice. I would personally stay away from using something like a ball peen hammer. I'm sure it would work, but you risk marring your frets a little bit more that way. I think something like a rubber mallet might be too soft and it wouldn't give the force necessary to drive the fret down in. I could be wrong on that. I have not tried that out to see, but it may or may not work. Another option is to use something like this, a fret press. Now there are commercial versions of these available that come as a complete unit, but again, they're a little bit pricey. This is one that I put together just from a cheap arbor press and some bits and pieces that I got at the hardware store or had laying around. You can find these arbor presses really inexpensive at places like Harbor Freight or even like a yard sale or flea market or something. You don't really need anything fancy, just a small arbor press will work fine. What I did for this one was I added a spring and a collar to the top of the post. That way it automatically will return when you press your frets into place. If you don't worry about that, it's not a big deal. It's just kind of a little added luxury so that you can just press your fret in and the handle will spring back up. To press in the frets, all I have installed here is a fret pressing caul. It's just a little swiveling deal that has a brass insert, and you can get the inserts in several different radiuses depending on what the fretboard radius is that you're working on. Now I always try to put a piece of wood underneath here so that when I'm pressing in some frets that I'm not pressing the back of the neck right into this steel base plate. You can leave some indents in there and make that a little bit tough to get out. So I always try to put a block of wood in there to protect the back of the neck. Also, I always try to do that before I shape the back of the neck, if at all possible. If not, it's not a big deal. You can still press your frets in even after it's shaped, but it's a little bit easier to keep it lined up if you do it before you shape the back of the neck. Maybe one day I'll build a little base or something for this, a wooden base that this kind of fits in, that already has kind of the supports built in, but who knows. After the frets are pressed in, you need to get all the ends nice and smooth. I use these little files that I actually did a build video on a while back. I'll put a link down below in the description, and you can check those out if you're interested in making them. Again, commercial versions of almost all the stuff that's homemade you can get. This just has a file set into a piece of wood at 90 degrees, which lets you ride it along the edge of the fretboard and file all of your frets even. After that, I follow it up with this that I believe is at a 30-degree angle. Could be 25, I don't quite remember, but it files the end of your fret at a bit of an angle, which makes it a little bit more comfortable to play. You don't necessarily need these. You can use just a regular file and spend some time filing each end nice and flush. Takes a little bit longer, but it's a regular flat file would work just fine. I also recommend some kind of a leveling beam so you can level all the tops of your frets once you have them installed. You can buy some, you can make some. I've made some as well, link down below. It's really nothing more than a super flat surface that you can attach some sandpaper to and sand along the top of your frets to make sure everything's nice and even. Another option would be to use a level. I've seen people use the edge of a level, which is a lot of times similar to this width, an inch or so, and you just attach some sandpaper and you can use a level. Levels are typically nice and flat, at least they should be, in order for them to do their job correctly. Here's one that I would definitely recommend buying. This is called a fret rocker, and it has 4 different dimensions on here that lets you get between any 3 frets, so you can put that on there and it will rock, and you'll be able to identify which frets are higher or lower, so you can address those as necessary with another file. A lot of people will use a specific fret file. Now this file has a concave shape ground into the top and the bottom, and this one in particular is diamond coated, and it works really well and actually cuts really fast, so you have to be careful, and you'll use that once you've leveled your frets to help put that crown back on there. Not necessary. Really nice to have, but absolutely not necessary. You can also use a straight file. Now this one I have specifically for crowning frets. So when you crown the frets, you're basically filing that curve back in, because after you've leveled it, you've cut that top off. So it's flat on the top and you need to put that curve back in. So you do that by filing and rolling your file over the top on either side to put that crown back in there. Now what I've done with this one is I have ground the edges nice and flat so that I've taken the teeth off the edge, so the edge is perfectly smooth so that it won't mar the fretboard and cause any damage to the neck of the guitar. I've also rounded it ever so slightly so that the edge is just a little bit soft, but this works really good. It takes time and you have to be super precise as you're filing along there, but it does work really well and definitely a much less expensive option than a file like this. If you're going to be making your own nuts, I would recommend some nut slotting files. These are essentially just a gauged file. They come in tons of different gauges and you basically size them appropriately to the dimensions of the strings that you're going to be applying. Another option I've seen people do is use like torch cleaning files, which are little round files available. They come in a little set for, I don't know, probably a few bucks or something like that. And they have lots of tiny little files in there that you can use those as well. I don't have any of those right now, or I would show you what they look like, but I'm sure if you look it up, torch cleaning files, it'll come up. It just folds out, kind of like a multi-tool kind of thing. There's just a whole bunch of little files that fly out of there, and you choose the size you need. Those would work well also because they're sized from very tiny to larger, much like these. For measuring during a setup, I recommend just a standard set of feeler gauges. You can pick these up about anywhere. I've gotten some at the hardware store, I've picked some up at the auto parts store, pretty much anywhere, and they're very inexpensive and very versatile for measuring a lot of things. Another thing you're going to need in some form, if you're building an electric guitar, some kind of a soldering iron and some solder. Doesn't really matter for the most part what kind of soldering iron you have. I don't recommend the large, what are they, like the 70 or 80 watt, like the gun type ones. A lot of times those can be too powerful and maybe melt the piece you're working on. This is the soldering station I use. It's made by Weller. It's really nice, has adjustable temperature. I think this goes up to 40 watts, but rarely do I find that I need to run it that high. If you're interested in checking this one out, I'll put a link down below in the description. Another thing nice to have, but not 100% necessary, good set of fret end nippers. These are ground off flat at the end, which lets you get right up next to the edge of the fretboard when you're cutting off frets. Also nice to have, but not necessary, is a notched straight edge. This allows you to measure neck relief with the frets installed in the guitar. You can just put this on and the frets go in these little grooves so that you can measure the flatness without the frets affecting it. So hopefully this gives you an idea of some of the tools that I use and recommend. It is not intended to be all inclusive. I know there's a ton of other tools out there that people use. Some may use one file over another file. I'm not trying to get into that sort of debate. These are just some of the things that currently at this moment that I'm using. Now I'm sure some of these tools are gonna rotate in and out as I learn different methods, but as of right now, this is what I'm using. I may cover some of the woodworking tools that I use. Let me know down below in the comments if that is something you'd be interested in seeing, kind of some of the power tools and things that I use when I'm building a guitar. So guys, I hope this answers some of your questions. There's been more than one person that's asked about this, so finally got around to getting to it and jumping in, and I hope that helped you out. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. Links down below to my website and social media. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Thanks a lot. We'll see you next time.